and we will dive right in. So, to start off, first of all, I want to say thank you so much, everyone, for joining us for this special event today. My name is Jennifer Bingham, and I am the Vice President of Operations here at MemoryFox. I know you are probably used to seeing and maybe even expecting to see our Marketing Director, Carly Euler, but she is actually wrapping up at a conference in Idaho today, so we wish her the best, and I'm excited to be joining you guys today. I'm especially excited because our host, Rachel from Instrumentl, she's going to be joining us, and someone who has had a lot of previous nonprofit experience where I was that grant writing, grant reporting person. I am so excited and thrilled for the topic that she has in store for us today. Before we dive right in, let me give a proper introduction to our host. Rachel Fidler Cannella is a skilled nonprofit professional with over a decade of experience in informal education at history, science, and art museums. Prior to joining Instrumentl, Rachel served as the Senior Manager of School and Teacher Programs at the National History Museums of Los Angeles County, my old stomping ground, leading educational programming for 150,000 plus annual school visitors across 2 county museum sites. She has also directed creative arts programming for teens and the elderly at the Holocaust Museum LA and designed educational or environmental education courses for early learners at the Portland Children's Museum in partnership with the Oregon Zoo. Such an impressive resume. I am excited to see what insight and what tips and tricks you have for us today. So take it away, Rachel.
Thanks so much for that lovely intro, Jennifer. And we'll have to talk more about your LA roots because I love to hear that that's something in your past history as well. Welcome,
Definitely.
folks. I'm so glad to have you here. I see some of you have already taken me up on my request to say hi in the chat box. If you don't mind sharing your name, your role, and the organization or location you might be streaming in from today, I just always love to hear a little bit more about who we have in the room with us. So hi to Evelyn and Patty. Thanks so much for being here. I do see some familiar names on the list here, so thanks to those friends that are coming back in. I'm also going to drop some important links for us today. This is an educational course. I'm giving you all some opportunities to dive back into our student mindset. As Jennifer mentioned, I have some experience leading school-based programs. So today I've designed a course that is intended to get us to think critically about our own best practices at our organizations. And the way I'm going to invite you to do that is using a workbook. So I'm going to drop these links in the chat. One is to create your own Google Doc copy. So when you click that Google Doc link, it'll prompt you to create an individual copy in your Google Drive. Or if you don't use the Google Suite, you can download a PDF version, and this is something that you should also be able to edit. I will call out when we're specifically going into these workbooks, but if you can click open that link, have it open in your browser, save it for a little bit later in the presentation, I'll call out when we'll be inviting each of you to think about how some of the lessons we're talking about today might apply to your organizations. Lastly, I do have a little discount code on the screen today. So for any of our new Instrumentl users, we are so excited to partner with MemoryFox, and we're offering $50 off your first month of Instrumentl if you use the code MemoryFox50. So write that down, save that for the end of the presentation. I'll talk a little bit more about how you can apply that. And otherwise, welcome. We'll go ahead and start getting rolling. Hi, Debbie. Hi, Therese. Hi, Ashley. Thanks so much for being here. So today we are starting with how to save time and win more grants. I know we're getting towards the end of 2024, which is hard to believe, but I think there's still time to think about how your 2024 grant strategy is currently going and ways you might be preparing for the next fiscal year or next calendar year, and think about how you can kind of optimize your grant strategy for that upcoming calendar year. Jennifer already introed me, but just as a quick reminder, I'm Rachel. I am a nonprofit professional who recently transitioned to Instrumentl end of last year. And my job is to help develop helpful and educational events like this one. So we're running webinars on a weekly basis at Instrumentl designed to help grant seekers and other folks focused on fundraising in their organizations find more grants and save time doing it. As an FYI, we'll be together for about the next 55 minutes. I'll try and keep it snappy so we can get through all of our good content and leave you with some stuff to noodle on and share with leadership. This webinar is being recorded, and I know the folks at MemoryFox will be sharing that out afterwards. So if you need any kind of refresh on anything, feel free to go back and look at that. You also are welcome to step away if you need. Please always feel free to take care of your personal needs. But we want to make sure you come back. I do have a little chance to win some raffle prizes at the end of the presentation today. So stick it out with us. We would love to have you at the end. And lastly, I am making sure that we have closed captions toggled on. I'm going to save that there. Perfect. So you can toggle that on in your own Zoom settings if you want to read along as well as listen to me as I'm presenting. A couple of key things for anyone that's coming into the room with us today. You have a few course materials. One is your course workbook. I'm going to drop that in the chat one more time, just as a reminder for today. The first link is that Google Doc copy. The second is a PDF version. Hey, Allison, great to meet you. Secondly, I'm going to give you some access to Instrumentl's funder database. I'll talk a little bit more about what that looks like and how you can get in there today. And finally, we do have a limited number of one-on-one strategy sessions with some of our grant advisors. It's one of our fun perks for joining the program today. So for any of our new users, I'll talk about how you can get access to those. Ideally, you leave this workshop with a few key awesome things. I'm going to give you hopefully a tailor-made list of good fit funders. You can literally walk into your boss's office if you're working at a physical location, or emailing them or slacking them later today and say, hey, I actually found 5 new foundations that we should be applying to grants for. I can almost 99.9% guarantee you'll walk away with that. And I'll buy anyone a coffee who doesn't have that on their list. I swear I'm going to get you a great list of good fit funders, and I'll explain how to do that. We'll also be able to access your best options. I checked this morning, our database currently has 19,648 active public and private funding sources for 501c3s based in the US. There's a ton on there, and I'll talk a little bit more about how you can use those. And then I'm hoping I'm going to save you hours of research. So we're going to talk a little bit about how the algorithm for Instrumentl works, but also talk about how our grant strategy as a whole is basically working to help you save time, right? If we strategize effectively, you should be spending less time sorting through not optimized funding sources or things that are not necessarily aligned to your organization and your needs, and actually spending time working on ones that will hopefully be successful. I mentioned that we do have this perk of a one-on-one strategy session today. There's only 10 spots. Our team is quite small. So I'll talk a little bit about how you can take advantage of that. If anyone wants to get a jump start, it'll basically be by using this link that I'm going to drop in the chat. You'll start your trial and you'll be able to book one of those calls when you get to that call screen. Otherwise, I'll get to that point in the presentation in just a second. But I want to explain a little bit more about where we're headed, what I'm covering with you all today. So we want to talk a little bit about our grant strategy as a whole, what our workflow looks like for our grant strategy. And for some of us, this might be kind of the first time we're thinking critically about this. For others, we might be experts in the room. We might already have a sense. I'm going to give you some tools to kind of think critically about where you might be more optimizing your strategy if you already have one in place. I'm going to give you 3 different strategies that I specifically have sourced from our expert council members. I'll talk a little bit more about that as we dive deeper into the content today. We're going to talk about the ROI framework, the PRO strategy, and then kind of dive deeper on this specific grants management strategy that you want to walk away with this workshop with. We're going to give everybody an opportunity to think about how all the things I've shared today apply to your individual experiences and your organizations. And then we'll wrap it up with some questions. My last thing before we get into content, this is CFRE certified. So if you are someone that is looking for initial certification towards CFRE, or you already are certified and looking to basically continue your hours, this is a course that's certified there. I can talk to anyone who's interested about getting those credits, but if you fill out our feedback form at the end, that'll basically indicate to me that, hey, this person stuck it out to the end of the presentation. They should get that 1 credit towards CFRE. So I'll share a little bit more about those details as we get to the conclusion of the program. With that, I'll keep an eye on the chat box as we get rolling, but I want to start with our workflow, right? So we have our grant strategy as a whole. It's overseeing a grant's entire journey that goes from research and applications to the funding milestones and final reporting. So I want to start us back in the pre-award phase, right? We're doing the search for those best fit funders and grants. We're doing that research and prospecting. Or maybe cultivating funder relationships. We're thinking about the valuable contacts that we have in the community through our board, through our leadership. We're submitting applications to the ones that we do find and working on those applications that take many, many hours. I know from folks in the room can probably relate to that. And we're following up on the pending submissions, right? Not pictured here is waiting with bated breath to see if we actually got the grant, which is, I think, one of the hardest parts of this job. Once we've scored those funds, oops, I'm going to jump ahead to my animations here. We still have to track across the post-award life cycle. So I like to think about our strategy, not just from what grants are we applying to, but how are we complying with those grants? And what if we win the grant? We should think of our pre-award strategy and our post-award strategy at the start of a grant cycle, not once we've won the grant. So we still need to track across the post-award life cycle, right? We've got financial monitoring, so spend down finance, making sure that we're using the funds like we said we would. We've got tracking all those deadlines and writing reports. So you might be responsible for getting impact measurements or evaluations done with folks who actually benefited from the funds that you were being awarded. We've got the compliance, right? This is kind of like one of our grant kind of experts always describes this as the broccoli of grants, but it truly is maybe one of the most important things, right? Is making sure you can legally comply with what you wrote out in your application and making sure that the program staff, the finance teams, anyone else that's supporting your grants initiatives is on board with this and knows this in advance. And then we've got our last one here is evaluating impact. Maybe one of the most challenging things and something I think grant seekers are often trying to figure out how to optimize, how to better explain how are they serving their community and making sure that you can demonstrate that in your final reporting. So I'm curious to hear from folks in the room. I'm going to invite folks to respond in the chat box with the number that best kind of answers this question for their organization. Which phase of the grant's life cycle is your biggest challenge? Is it number 1, research and prospecting, finding or documenting all those opportunities? Is it number 2, applying and following up, perhaps actually writing the grant applications? Number 3, is it compliance and finance, that kind of post-award stage? Number 4, is it reporting and the evaluation? 5 is all the above, or 6, something else. And I'd love to hear in the chat if folks have other things that maybe are some of those kind of key challenges that come up when you think about your grant strategy. Love it. I'm seeing a lot of 1s. Okay, yep, Allison says 5. I'm very new to the process. Yeah, the reporting process can be much more extensive than we sometimes imagine. Okay, a couple 1s. Yep, I'm seeing that. Some 5s, some 2s, applying and following up. Yep. A few 4s here and there. Absolutely. And if there's something I didn't indicate, I'd love to hear in the chat. These are great insights. It's also nice to be in a room with people who are maybe experiencing some of the same challenges you are as a grant seeker, and just knowing you're not alone in some of that work makes us feel a little more connected. And I'm hoping that some of the strategies I can share with you today can hopefully address some of these biggest challenges. So we're focusing on the ways we can get your organizations focusing more strategically on their grants process and help you get out of some of those cycles of survival mode that we often find ourselves in with grant seeking. So I've worked with our partners to identify these key strategies. I'm going to dive into each one and explain how you might think about it in reflection of your own organization. The first one here is going to be the ROI framework. And I'm going to have our expert kind of explain a little bit more about what that looks like. But first, Teresa Huff, she's a nonprofit strategist at Grant Writing Simplified, and she's one of our partners. I thought this quote was great. She says, just like training for a marathon, it takes a lot of preparation and work to apply for a grant. There's a better way to go about grant funding than saying, just get a grant for that. How many of you in the room have heard someone say, just get a grant for that? It's easy. I know I face that a lot with leadership in my different capacities, and it's not that simple. It does require training. It requires intentionality. And that's why Teresa has this really impressive kind of ROI framework to help us strategize around this. So her belief is that the true ROI, right? We hear the term ROI a lot. She's kind of reframed this specific to grant seeking and says that the true ROI should be these 3 components. You need to be relevant, you need to be optimized, and you need to be interacting. And I'll talk about each one of these and what that means, some of those indicators there. But what she says is that organizations that have all 3 of these in place those are the ones that grow and are extremely successful and are thriving versus those who are having trouble getting the momentum they need to keep going, right? So let's talk a little bit about each of these kind of spokes of this three-sided stool here. The first is the relevance piece. What indicators Teresa says you should look for is that there is a demonstrated need for your organization in the community. And probably more importantly, you have the data that supports your cause and why it is needed. Secondly, you're always considering the relevance of the grant maker to your organization. This seems like a no-brainer, but sometimes we can get a little bit caught up applying to multiple things. We have a lot of coals in the fire or whatever that kind of idiom is, thinking about the different ways that we're trying to get funding across different funders. You want to make sure that you are very clearly demonstrating to the grant maker that this is why your organization is relevant to them. When we get into the optimization piece, we want to make sure our nonprofit is fully up and running. This is something that Teresa finds is really important. And I know some of us may be in the very early stages of our nonprofit, but in order to have a sustainable grants system and grant strategy, you need to have solid infrastructure in place with policies and procedures around your grant seeking. We also want to make sure our mission is super clear and the direction the organization going is articulated clearly. We want to think about the ways that this is demonstrated with our organization. Think about, how a funder hears about your organization for the first time. Sometimes it's through the grant application, but maybe they look on your website and are just trying to get a sense of who you are as an organization. Is your mission super clear on there? Is the direction your organization going and the sustainability your organization has demonstrated clearly? An investor in any capacity, be it nonprofits, we're talking, for-profit entities, is not going to donate or invest into something that isn't clear or is confusing. The last piece here is the interaction. We want to make sure we're building these authentic, meaningful relationships across our staff, our volunteers, our board, and other service providers. These could be partners that would be fantastic for you to think about how to engage with, maybe folks who have even received funding from a funder you're kind of eyeing and thinking about engaging with. Make sure you're connecting with those folks and seeing how their relationship with that funder was created and how it's going for them. You also want to make sure you're always speaking to the person on the other end of the funding line, right? Grant makers are people too. And one thing that Teresa says here is that business moves at the speed of trust, right? That's kind of a famous quote there, but we want to make sure we're building that trust, we're showing that we're reliable, and we're treating them like people. We're building a relationship there. The ways you can do this, I'm sure some of you have ideas in the chat, and feel free to add that too, of how you've built meaningful relationships with funders. Some folks have invited funders to attend events, program activities, or site visits. This firsthand experience is going to help, just continue to bolster the trust and show off your organization in a way that's truly authentic. So after hearing about kind of those three different elements, I'm going to invite folks to share again in the chat box. Which of these three areas do you feel like your organization is currently the strongest? So let's think about our strengths. Is it the relevance piece? Is it the optimization, the interaction, or we're still working on all three, which is totally reasonable as well. I'll give folks just a moment. I see a couple coming in, a couple fours. That's totally fine. We've got some time to optimize there. Okay, let's see. So Allison says that 3, their interactions are super strong. Mary says their relevance. So does Mike. I see we've got a couple of combos. Some people feel like they're doing really well. Okay, I love that. Yeah, so think about if you know which ones are strong and you're like, okay, our organization has got this. Which one is not and why? What are some of those indicators to you that maybe your organization needs to grow a little bit in that capacity? I'm going to invite Teresa to actually share a little bit about what happens when organizations are lacking one of those 3 key aspects, kind of what happens when they struggle with one of those.
Now, nonprofits may have 2 of the 3, and they can make some progress, but there's still something kind of missing. So if we look at this possible combination, they could be relevant and optimized, but if they're not interacting, then they're inauthentic. And this is not a good place to be. This is kind of like the nonprofit who said to me, we talked to that foundation, we argued with them 3 different times, and 3 different times they turned us down. I wonder why. That's probably not a good approach and not a good authentic relationship building strategy. That's why it's so important to have this piece in place. Now, they could be relevant and interacting, but if they're not optimized, they're terribly inefficient. The technical term for this is a hot mess. And it's also not a good place to be, because then you're kind of all over the place and disorganized, and nobody's going to quite trust what you're doing, and you're not going to seem like a good, solid investment. I see a lot of new nonprofits that don't have programs up and running yet, and they're saying, where can we find grants to get going? And I tell them, you're not going to find grants yet. You need to get your programs running. You need to be stable and sustainable for the funders and the grant makers to want to invest in you. So they need to look at other sources of funding to make sure things are optimized and running efficiently. And finally, they could be optimized and interacting well, but they're not relevant. And this is a tough place because then they're ineffective. The work they're doing is just not quite hitting the mark, and people aren't understanding what they're doing and why it's so important.
So I love that that piece there with Teresa, because I think it just reminds us that it's great to think about our strengths. And I love highlighting that for folks too, because we have a lot of work on our plates. We want to think about the things we're doing well, but also we want to think about the ways that maybe we might be hindering our organizations by missing out on some of these aspects of strategy. So I've got a workbook moment for you all, and I'm going to add the link back to that in the chat just to make sure if anyone joined us late, you have access to that. You're going to open up your workbook and you're going to go to page 3. What I've basically done is I've taken those prompts, those indicators that Teresa wrote that we just talked about, and I'm going to invite you to go through this page and kind of check off, look at these check boxes and say, okay, great. Our organization does have demonstrated need. It does, maybe need some areas of growth here, and you can indicate those in some quick notes. But you're going to essentially go through and check those off. I'm going to give folks, this is a quick exercise because we've got a lot of content to cover, about a minute and a half or so to go through this checkbox and start to jot down some really quick scratch notes of areas of growth and strength. And I'll invite folks to jump in there. If anyone needs the workbook again, I'm going to drop that link in the chat. And as a reminder, we're on page 3. So I'll give folks about a minute and a half or so to jot down some notes. As you finish this exercise, feel free to add some of those areas of strength and growth in the chat so we can learn a little bit from each other of where we're at. I see Evelyn says, revising my answer, we're also strong 3 across those relationships. We have space to do better with donors. Yeah, something to reflect on. Maybe add that into your workbook so you can reference back to it later. We're looking on page 3. We have 3 different categories here: relevance, optimization, and interaction. Think about how well your organization is doing as each of these. I already see Allison has added some thoughts to the chat. For relevance, we need to get better at identifying and communicating with foundations that have shared interests. It sounds like such a simple task, right? But that can really be something that can make or break your success rate with these different applications and kind of the prospecting that you're doing as an organization. I'm going to give folks like a 30-second or so warning. It's fast. Jennifer says, at my old organization, we could have grown in relevance as well. Sometimes pursuing grant funding can be a game of casting the widest net. 100%. Seeing what's out there and seeing what kind of tugs at your line, what makes the most sense to pursue. Kylie says, we often struggle with competing with similar organizations in the area. Yeah, that can be a struggle as well, trying to kind of distinguish yourself as a distinct organization that's maybe serving a different need, or maybe you're optimized a little better than your kind of competing organizations, but you need to make sure you can demonstrate that really clearly. I'll give folks about 10 more seconds. As a reminder, this workbook is yours to use. I hope you will use it beyond just this hour that we're together and think about how you might be inspired by some of the things you're writing down and reference back on it when you're a little stuck thinking about that you can improve your practice. All right. I'm going to jump us into the next section. Again, something for you to come back to. I know that was quick, but I love seeing some responses in the chat. Please feel free to add more, react to some of your colleagues' kind of reflections here, and share any similar experiences folks might be having in the chat box. Okay, so our next strategy here is another one from one of our partners. It's called the PRO strategy. I'm going to talk a little bit about how you might think about this in relation to your organization. But first, I want to introduce the expert who coined this term, and we'll be talking about kind of her approach to this with nonprofits. This is Patrice Schumont. She's the founder of A Village for Good. I encourage you to follow her on LinkedIn. She has some great insights. She's just someone that's a wealth of knowledge. She says that in working with nonprofit organizations starting or growing a grant program, I find they usually struggle with preparation, realistic expectations, and organization as we explore funding opportunities and funder prospects. Something I think that many of us struggle with and is not necessarily always clearly identified, right? So how to become a pro? We want to focus in on each of these elements, that preparation, those realistic expectations, and our organization, and think about how that can apply to our current grant strategy. So I'm going to dive into each of these. And Patrice has some really clear questions that we want to be asking ourselves. So think about what you might answer as I go through each of these questions in these sections. For preparation, you want to start with this one. Are your programs clearly identified? Even if a whole calendar full of opportunities, that align with the mission and services is found, the organization still has to be really prepared to apply for the grants, right? So you want to make sure that you are clearly identifying your programs. You also want to make sure you have supporting research and a concise understanding of need. This goes back and dovetails really well with Teresa's relevance component. We want to make sure that we're really demonstrating that understanding of need and concisely, emphasizing that word, able to kind of pitch it, right? What is our elevator pitch for our organization? And the last one for preparation here, do we have a strong narrative that we've already written or constructed, something that's been kind of tried and true about how we're demonstrating need in our community and with our organization that we can build from? I know, Patrice says that many people are eager to start looking for funds to support all that important work that you're doing, but applying to those funds before some of these things are in place will likely only serve as a lesson of what not to do. Just something that Patrice highlights. So her solution that she suggests here, spend that dedicated time preparing for prospecting. She says, learn what it takes to turn prospects into effective grant applications and ensure you have the internal structures that support continued grant work. So I'm curious if folks in the chat have thoughts here. What are some internal structures at the organization that are supporting your grant work that you feel like are helping to get to some of this preparation that's required for grant seeking? Maybe there are certain tools or tactics that you're using, to keep track of grants you're working on, funder relationships you're building. I'll give folks a second to think about it and add some thoughts to the chat box. Some other examples that I've heard that have been really beneficial. Folks often have a standing meeting with maybe program officers or other staff who are involved in the grant seeking process to update them on the prospecting funnel that they're working on, or just make sure that they know we won this grant and then we're going to have some deadlines coming up for it. Yeah, Jennifer says, I found the library of past grant applications super helpful. Yeah, does anyone use like boilerplate templates or have kind of a repository of those really amazing grant applications we've written that we can pull from? Evelyn says, our development and marketing teams built case statements with each program season that are shared out with internal and external stakeholders that summarize our programs, the need, the historical impact, and why continued support matters. I love to hear that. That is something that I think everyone in this room could benefit from incorporating into their strategy. Awesome. Allison says we have really well-defined programs that have been established in the community for more than 50 years. That's very, very helpful. Debbie says we have a process for moving grants through committee structure. We use a project management tool that documents each step of the process. That's exactly what we're talking about here, right? How we optimize our processes so that folks can be involved in the process, make sure they understand the expectations. I think that's really great. I'm curious, Debbie, too, if you want to add in the chat anything that, if you feel like that's been going really well, or if you feel like there's improvements that you've made, any reflections there would always be interesting to hear. I'm going to go ahead and move us into our next section to talk a little bit about this piece, which is also super valuable. Realistic expectations, right? A strong list of prospects does not necessarily mean funding is guaranteed. And many of us know that grant work is a long game, requires some strategy to ensure those efforts are meaningful. And that can mean that even funding that doesn't come from an application, right? Sometimes you might have funding that comes from a relationship that you've built. So the questions around these expectations, the first one here is that, is grant funding an intentional part of a larger funding strategy? We also want to see if we have dedicated staff to look for funders and build those relationships or partnerships with them. I know some folks in the room might be coming from some of these smaller organizations where you're a one-person grant team, or maybe you even don't have a grant team and you are the one-person show that's running all of this. Think about how, what might be the tipping point for you to decide you really need a dedicated person to specifically focus on grants. Are you prepared for the requirements and management once funding opportunities are secured? Very important. And we talked about the beginning of this workshop, right? I mentioned we should be looking at our grants through a post-award lens. We should be thinking about the whole grants life cycle before we even apply. This is a clear expectation that needs to be set up front, that we are able to comply with the requirements of the grant. And lastly, are you ready for, do you have the time that it takes to sort through all those potential funding opportunities? So Patrice's solution here, if you're answering some of these questions for yourself, is to first recognize that philanthropy and grant work do require this constant effort, and it can be really competitive, right? So she suggests that making sure the person who's doing that prospecting and grant work knows what they're in for and is prepared to educate the rest of the team, the board, leadership along the way as well. So the expectations can be really clear up front. You might have board members that we can relate to that, are wondering about our grant process and saying, well, why don't we apply to the, I don't know, I'm trying to think of a good example here. Probably like a Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation grant or something. I know I've seen a lot of those on LinkedIn of like, there's millions of dollars that are going out to all these organizations. You want to be able to make sure you set these expectations in advance so that whoever is asking those questions understands how it applies to your overall strategy. We're not just going for stuff because there's money out there. We're going for stuff because it applies and is relevant to our organization. On this topic, I'm curious to learn from the room. How have you educated leadership on what your grant work entails. Is anyone doing anything they find particularly effective in getting leadership on board with how we approach these grants? I see Evelyn's comment. This actually is probably relevant for this question as well. We manage ours through Asana, and it has been a game changer. So +1 on that project management tool use. A great way to get visibility. What other ideas have worked for kind of getting leadership on board with our strategy? Because they're going to be the ones that drive a lot of this for our organization. I know some folks, when they're using tools to display their kind of prospecting funnel, they want to have a board member that maybe is like a liaison or something for grants, and that can be the person that's checking in, can see like, okay, here's where we're going with these grants. We're not just like applying willy-nilly. I'm going to be the representative on the board that's really aware of the grants pipeline, and you as the grant seeker is making sure they're involved in that process. Okay, Debbie says we've recently been allowing our leadership team to be involved in writing the grants. Oh, this is super interesting. Small organization. Okay, that's really cool. Allison says using pathos and tying it back to our mission and the direct services it will help provide. Got to remind some folks, right? Like, this is why this is relevant. This is why we're spending time on these pieces. Love to hear that. Our last piece for the pro strategy that I want to highlight is organization, which some folks, it sounds like, are doing a great job of. But of course, an important part of preparing for all this grant strategy is organizing all the tasks and subsequent actions of the grant process. So the first question here, once you find prospects, do you have a place to keep and update the information? Maybe something that's a little more robust than an Excel spreadsheet that lives in one person's computer, or maybe a shared Google sheet or something. Again, this goes back to kind of the dedication of staff and time. Do you have a person that's dedicated to starting relationships with potential funders? Do you have the capacity to allow for a person that's sole purpose is really kind of focused on that relationship building or donor cultivation? Do you have an effective way to share important prospect information and keep people informed over time? Talking a little bit about that based on kind of our last slide there. So Patrice's solution here is look for the tools that can help you. They're going to keep and manage important prospecting and grant application and award information. And she just reminds us that there's a lot of options outside of Excel and Google Docs. Thankfully, we're at a really wonderful time in the technological world where we have a lot of tools that are out there. And she wants to remind us that that might help us get to a more optimized place in our organization. Okay, last question here. I know we already mentioned some ideas. What other tools are we using to stay organized? Things that we're using for overall grant strategy, or just maybe nonprofit organization in general that have been really helpful. Mia says sticky notes for sure. Maybe a lot of stuff stored in our brains. Those are good tools. A little tough to share with others though. Marianne says Excel and Outlook. Yep. Probably got a lot of email threads with potential connections or updating our grants team. Kylie says a spreadsheet tracker of successful versus unsuccessful applications. That's great, so that you can look back and have some historical data on what was working well, what didn't end up getting approved. Yeah. Evelyn says Asana and Salesforce. The dream is to one day to afford the integration of both so they can speak with one another. Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. So some other folks in the room might have a CRM that is helping them keep track of those funders, those donors, how we're engaging with them across the organization, right? If you have a membership team that's working with a member who also could be a fantastic donor or connection to a foundation that you're pursuing, these are things you want to know. Ashley says a grants calendar. I love this. It's so simple, right? Why not just make sure that you have a grants calendar that's visible across the organization, that's shared And she says there with development and programs teams. That's great. Sometimes the programs teams get a little left off of the pipeline, right? Because you're applying for those grants, you're maybe getting great little impact statements and reports from them. You get the grant, and then it turns out that the lead of the program team never shared that the grant is happening and that we're supposed to be reporting on it or evaluating it. That's really, really helpful. Awesome. So just some key takeaways for this pro kind of stage, right? We want to make sure we know that grant seeking is a really involved process. That's something that we probably already have a sense of if we are grant seekers in our organization, but making sure that leadership understands that, that element there. Don't start until you're ready for the work. That's, I think, a through line, not just from Patrice's strategy, but also Teresa's. And that staying organized will help you take some of this initial work that you're doing from maybe the survival mode up into an expert level where you're taking your organization really to the next stage of their grant seeking strategy. So I have one more workbook moment for you all, or maybe this is my second one, getting towards the end of our presentation here, but I do want you to think a little bit about some of these questions I just asked. So you can go back in your workbook on pages 4 and 5. I have these questions here. And you can answer with simple yes or no. This will be a quicker exercise than our previous one. I invite you to go through and answer these questions for your organization. Write any notes as you're going to. If you said no to anything, indicate a couple of ideas that you might have or reasons why your organization is not maybe checking that box right now. I'll give folks about 60 seconds to work independently in their workbooks. I'll drop that link in the chat one more time for anyone who missed that. As a reminder, we're on page 4 and 5 of our workbook. If you want to give me a little thumbs up in the chat box when you've gotten through all these questions, that'll just give me a sense of where we're at with everybody and make sure we're ready to move on to our final strategy here. Awesome. I'm seeing some thumbs ups come through. I'm curious for the folks that are done, was it easy for you to think through these? Were you like, yep, I know exactly what we're doing. I know I get a sense like these questions are easy to answer, or was it a little tricky? Awesome, Allison, that's great. Allison mentioned this is a great tool for reflection and for giving me a sense of how to get started. Yeah, it can sometimes feel just like this amorphous blob of stuff that we're working on. And strategy is, it's a big picture statement, right? So I like to think about some specifics so then we can maybe identify these areas where a nonprofit is struggling or where a nonprofit is doing really well and, really reflect with our leadership on some of those components so we can better advocate for our organization, truly. Yeah, Caroline says definitely points to where the holes are. Wow, Ashley says this is my 9th day at this org, so this is helping me quickly orient myself. That's probably so helpful. These notes are going to be like a gold mine to you, and you've been at the job for 3 months, and you're like, okay, what was it that when I was in my first week or second week that stood out to me? That's so helpful to hear. That's great, Evelyn, but great validation that we're better off than I thought. And Allison says here, I found some that were midway between a yes or no, so helpful to have a way to reflect on those areas. Great. Yeah, kind of what it would influence you to sway one way or the other. I think these are great conversations that we can then take with us to our leadership. All right, folks, you have been sticking it out through a lot of great learning today. So I'm going to wrap us up with a little bit more of a specific ask here. So we are going to be drafting some ideas around a strategy plan, right? We're not going to create that necessarily for our organization. That's going to be up to many of us, our leadership. We may not be in a position where we're driving the organization's strategy as a whole, but I think we have some good questions we can answer on our grant seeking side that can help our overall organization strategy move forward. So I have a couple of questions. These are in the last page of your workbook. I'm going to go through those first, and then you can spend a little moment thinking about these. This might be something that you reflect on after the workshop. But I've broken it into these let's see, I've got 3 different stages that we're going to focus the strategy around for grants. The first is research and prospecting. You've learned a little bit about where maybe some of the areas of growth and strengths are for your organization in this workshop. What types of grant opportunities should you be focusing on moving forward that more closely align with your mission and your financial goals? So this can be a rhetorical question that you kind of ruminate on for a second. This can be something you document. We're going to think about some of these more tangible ways our strategy is applying to grants. For the planning for grant awards, like let's think ahead, right? Post-award strategy in the pre-award phase. Are we currently measuring and compiling program outcomes and successes? How? If awarded grants, how will we manage reporting and following up? So reflect a little bit on that stage for your organization. Where are you at there? Feel like you have a good grasp of that. And then lastly is just the strategic development, like just reflecting on how we are strategizing as a whole with the organization. How effectively are these current strategies we're using at the organization aligning with our goals? And what adjustments might be necessary to improve our grant strategy? As a final summary statement, I'd love us to walk away in the next couple of minutes with one thing you are hoping to improve in your grant strategy. So think about all these things we've written down, some of the notes we've jotted down. In a summary statement, kind of what is the number one thing you are hoping to improve in your grant strategy? That's the last thing I'm going to invite you to do in your workbook today. If you go to page 6, you'll see this strategy worksheet. Again, something you can fill out more later. But what I'm asking us to do as a last thing is that summary box. I want us to get to the number one thing. And you can change this. You don't have to like hold yourself to this, but let's think about that number one thing. And if folks, when they have it, want to drop it in the chat, I would love to hear one thing you'd like to improve in your grant strategy. I'll give folks another like 60 seconds or so to think about it, write some notes down. I already see Carolyn has one in there. A more formal grant structure. Yeah. We've got making the time to apply for more grants. Yep. We got to make time to save time too, right? That's sometimes a challenge when we are burning the candle at both ends. Allison says, creating a procedure for seeing the grant process all the way through from research to final report. Yep, that's going to be a game changer for optimizing this grants workflow. I see time. Yeah, finding time for all of this. Mary Ann says, better interaction with grant makers. So some of that relationship building, some of that cultivation process. Debbie says, prioritizing grants based on our mission and the funder's goals. Love that. Oh, this person says, this has helped me think more strategic on which grant applications I'm applying for. Love that. We got a shared doc with all the grants we applied for. Yeah, improved efficiency. Yes, yes, yes. Resources can be pricey. Yeah, so Evelyn, that's kind of a great segue in my next piece here. And I think some of it is figuring out where are we optimizing and advocating for our organizations if we're at a place where we feel like we're on this precipice of better strategy, right? Like we have some initial things in place. We've got these programs that are running amazingly. We're sustainable. We have like the staff that are ready to go, or maybe still kind of hitting some roadblocks. I think that that's where sometimes organizations find themselves spinning their wheels, right? So I'm going to offer some solutions here to that specific question. I did say at the beginning, I'd give you some access to some new funder lists. And that's something I really want everybody to walk away with. A tailor-made list and some good fit funders. You'll also get access to this database immediately. So I'll show you how you can access the funder database that we have at Instrumentl with now almost 20,000 public and private funding sources. I'm hoping this will really save you a ton of time, and I can show you how that matching algorithm works. And we have some spots for a strategy session. So you just wrote one thing you're hoping to improve in your grant strategy. That is a perfect topic to spend 15 minutes with a grant advisor on, and it's a free session. So I really encourage you to take advantage of that. The way you're going to do this, you're going to use this link that I'm dropping in the chat right now. It's specific to the folks that are in this room. That's why it's got this MemoryFox event tag at the end. You're going to click on that link and you'll see on the left-hand side an option to fill out your information and kickstart a trial. This is 14 free days for you to explore the platform. No credit card required. You get right in there and you'll get to explore how Instrumentl can find some of these funding opportunities for you. So you'll fill out your information. It'll invite you to ask or invite you to share a couple of details about your organization and where you're at with strategy. This will also help when you get to the booking screen and you can schedule your call with someone. They'll be able to get a sense of where you're at. If you've won grants before, if you're really a pro at getting the grants, or maybe you've already have some sustainable grants in place, they'll be able to kind of see what you've answered there and give you some suggestions based on your specific organizational capacity. So you can book these. This calendar is live, so it'll just fill up with folks as they book these slots. And then you'll actually be able to create your first project. Now, I'm not going to go too far in depth with the actual project creation right now, because I want to get us to some questions and reflecting on some of the things we've learned. But this is a little behind the scenes snippet of what Instrumentl's grant tracker looks like. You'll see over here on this screen, I've saved 15 different opportunities in my tracker. This is for, I did a small museum looking for education program funding. So that's why these are related to arts and culture grants. You can see that Instrumentl organizes these by the name of the opportunity, the upcoming deadline, and you can also see the status of what they're looking for. So some of these, right, might be an LOI deadline, it might be an application deadline. You can see the status that I've indicated for where I'm at with the grant. You can see the amount that's awarded and any tasks that are associated with that particular grant, which is so helpful if you're looking to show to leadership, like, hey, here's where we're at with this particular opportunity, or you have multiple team members that are working on the same opportunity, making sure they know who's on first. You can also see some notes that I've written. I have one opportunity that I kind of wrote a couple of details about. This is also helpful when you have multi-person grant teams and you're trying to make sure they're all aware of what's going on. So all of these came from my matches. And when you set up your first project, you'll actually be able to see right now I have 100+ matches over here. And I can actually go through and look through all the different funding opportunities that were aligned with my organization and the specific project I'm looking for funding for. So the cool thing about Instrumentl is this algorithm matching that'll basically find those fields of work, those areas of funding needs that you specifically indicated, and then match you with funders that are designed for that specific opportunity. As a reminder, I shared this at the very beginning, but we do have a little discount for folks that are from our MemoryFox event today. So save that. If you're interested in exploring Instrumentl, you can get $50 off your first month with MemoryFox 50. It's a great little discount to save. And I'm happy to answer any questions that folks have about using the tracker or finding funders. We have some great tips there to just make it as easy as possible for you to find any of your next funding opportunities and keep track of them for everybody. So a couple of key things we covered today. We talked about the grant strategy workflow as a whole. We went through a couple of key strategies that'll hopefully identify some of the areas of growth and areas that you're doing really well as an organization. We had a moment to think about how this might apply to our individual needs. And now we have time for a few questions or any wrap-up reflections. So questions. I already see one from Debbie, so I'm just going to go ahead and answer that really quickly. So what you'll do is when you fill out your trial sign-up form that I dropped in the chat, and I'll drop that one more time, you're going to start by filling out your first project. So it'll prompt you to basically input some information about a funding opportunity that you're currently looking for. Things like how much money are you looking to get awarded? What types of funders are you looking for? What we call them fields of work, but essentially what keywords should we use to indicate whether or not a funder is a good fit or a bad fit. And then once you've created that project, you'll go to the next screen. It'll prompt you with, we found your 116 opportunities for you. That's where you'll immediately be able to see the funders list. You can also use the quick search function in Instrumentl. So if you already know of a couple of funders, you're like, hey, I'd be curious to see what the Mellon Foundation is currently awarding right now. You can do a quick search there and look for funders. You can do a deep dive on the funder profile, We actually pull information from 990s, so you can easily digest some of that information, see the average amounts awarded, see past grantees, things like key people at the organization, board members, foundation president, and other things like average amount of grants awarded year over year. All of that information will be immediately accessible once you create that first project. Other questions, other reflections, things that people are noodling on that they want to share in the chat box before I wrap us up? I loved hearing all of these amazing reflections from folks on where they're at with their organization. I encourage you to use these resources that I shared throughout the remainder of 2024 and think about maybe how you might use them when you're building your next year strategy. This is something that I find is sometimes a scramble when we're like, oh my gosh, 2025 is here. Think about maybe like some of these areas you've already indicated in the workbook that you could address with leadership for the remaining quarters and the quarters to come. All right, my last request for folks, I'd really love to hear what you thought. If there are things that would be helpful for you to learn for future, if you, have any reflections about things that were particularly helpful with this webinar, I'd love to hear your feedback. So you can share that. That'll again, also, if anyone is getting that CFRE credit, you can reach out to me. This will be kind of an indicator that you were here for the presentation, that you stuck it out to the end, you get your full credit. That feedback form is in the chat. I'll drop it one more time just in case anyone missed it. And one more thing I really am excited to highlight, because we are partnering with MemoryFox on this program, and we are so thrilled to have this opportunity for folks. We're hosting something called the Nonprofit Growth Summit. So this is happening 2 weeks from today. We're exploring actionable strategies to take your nonprofit to the next level and set yourself up for success for the remainder of this year and going into the new year. It'll be full of panel discussions on workshops, very similar to the format that I just went through with you all today. Some networking and some industry leaders and nonprofit leaders who will be speaking to some of these indicators of success with their organization. We think this event will sell out. We are already over 50% full for this. I know some folks in the room have already even signed up. So if you haven't yet, please feel free to register. It's free if we invite 2 friends to join you. So I know there's many folks who have nonprofit colleagues who might benefit from kind of a deep dive virtual summit like this. So we would love to see you there. And I encourage you to register today so you don't miss out on a spot. Also, if you just liked what you learned today and think you could benefit from other webinars like this, we do these all the time. So I'll just drop a link to our Instrumentl webinars event page. We'd love to have any of the folks in this room at any of our other programs as well. With that, here's my contact information. If anyone has any questions, happy to answer. You can email me. And thanks again, Jennifer and MemoryFox, for hosting us today.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Rachel, for joining us today. And thank you all for taking a moment to learn with us. I don't know about you, but I found this webinar very educational. I kind of actually wish I was still working at a nonprofit so I could implement all the wonderful strategies that you went over today, Rachel. So thank you again for that. A quick reminder that we will be sending out a copy of this webinar tomorrow. And then lastly, before you go, if you have not registered yet, I would love to invite you all to MemoryFox's next event. It's going to be the 4th installment of our Narratives with Integrity panel, where we will be discussing strategies for collecting, organizing, and most importantly, writing consent forms as it pertains to nonprofit storytelling. We hear this topic all the time from our customers about how to draft a really good consent that covers all your bases. So please be sure to join us. I believe it is next Tuesday, but I'll double check. And we're really excited to have 4 amazing experts in their fields give us insight into writing and collecting with your consent forms. And then with that, I'm just going to drop a quick link in the chat for that. So definitely be sure to check that out. It's going to be super informative. And lastly, again, thank you guys so much for taking the time to join us today. And especially Rachel, thank you so much for taking the time to teach us today. We hope to see you all again soon. Enjoy the rest of your day. Bye.
Bye, folks.